American people, and the election in 2016 was a resounding rejection of that behavior.
But the sanctions regime, which had preceded that deal, which was ended with it, actually inside Iran, American sanctions had the effect, surely, of encouraging support for the Khomeini and the regime on a nationalist basis, bringing back and deliberately, of course, dragged up all sorts of things, including the 1953 American-British coup inside Iran.
I would disagree with that in a few ways. I mean, granted, if there's going to be any sort of economic constriction in your country, there will be anger from the people. But 40% of the Iranian regime's revenue comes from oil, and the squeezes that Pompeo has put has taken about $10 billion off of there. Their economy is in the toilet. The people are in the streets rioting. The freedom-loving people whose country was stolen from them certainly are looking at this as an opportunity finally to get out of the dire straits they've been. I have personal friends who do business from Turkey in Iran, and they tell me that it's the first time in a long time that there's hope that somebody's finally stepping up and standing for their ideals through action, as opposed to hollow words and promises and paper agreements that ultimately haven't fixed the situation and have created a terrorist sponsoring major influence in the Middle East. That's not good for America. That's not good for anybody in the area, and it's not good especially for the poor people of Iran who've been going through one of the worst situations anybody could imagine, having your country taken from you and having to be in such a poor financial straits for so long because of your leadership.
But what you're suggesting here is a regime change agenda, and where that has been attempted elsewhere with American and Allied intervention, it has been, to be honest, a disaster.
I actually agree, and that's a good point, and America needs to learn from those mistakes. Trump said during the election, actually, interestingly, that he did not want to see America do new nation building. And in this case, this isn't a new situation. It's no secret that Pompeo, Trump, and the administration want to remove the Ayatollah from power. But the difference here is we're not going in there with bombers and fighter jets and tanks. We're not spending trillions of dollars. We are trying to do that through economic forces, because ultimately the prior strategies to removing brutal dictators have not worked. You can look at the tremendous failure in Libya with Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama's disastrous situation with Gaddafi as just a very recent example of how terrible these things can go. So the restraint and sort of adult in the room that the Trump administration has kind of brought to this, putting their foot down but not sending in bombs and fighters, I think they have a very strong chance of inspiring the Iranian people to finally take their country back.
Well, let's look at that, because when Mike Pompeo has said that he wants zero Iranian oil exports, what you mentioned there is the latest move by the Trump administration is to end what's called the waivers, whereby certain countries were allowed to import Iranian crude oil. Those certain countries included China, India, and Japan. They are major powers in the world today, and they cannot be happy with that decision.
No, they can't be happy with it because, I mean, ultimately they're getting a good deal from the Iranians. But the fact of the matter is there is plenty of oil supply out there. Any expert can tell you. You have Saudi and the Emiratis pledging to fill the gaps. U.S. oil production is up 1.6 million barrels a year. This year it's going to be up 1.2 million barrels next year. The supply is there. Now, Modi has an interesting problem because he has an election coming up and he can't be seen appeasing the Americans too much. But the Chinese, on the other hand, they're embroiled in a trade war that has devastated, their local stock market. And it wouldn't be so unreasonable to imagine Trump giving a little quid pro quo for help here in this situation, because there is one drawback with this max pressure strategy, that if you go in at Iran, you're going at Venezuela, you're going at trade wars, and unlike Barack Obama's coalition of people, Trump is going at it alone. So there is a risk of being spread thin, but ultimately they have the leverage and they have the moral high ground. It's not as though we're asking people to pull back from some sort of noble power. This money is funding Hezbollah. This money is funding Hamas. This money is funding a ballistic missile program that is in violation of UN Security Council Resolution 2231. It's against the international world order and coalition of freedom-loving people. So I think they will be willing, and especially the Japanese, who since Trump's election have been nothing but friends and allies with us.
The Europeans, on the other hand, would counter what you've just said and say the Iranians have kept their side of the bargain. And unusually, the United Kingdom finds itself out of step with the USA in alliance with France and Germany at opposing Trump's stand on sanctions against Iran and ending the agreement, the nuclear agreement.
Perhaps Iran has been fulfilling the agreement that will let them get a nuclear bomb. I mean, they're testing the missiles right next to the place where they're not enriching the uranium for shooting the missiles. They're not allowing inspectors into the places. They're building propulsion systems. They're funding these things. And the idea that that agreement is even valid in the eyes of the American people, I mean, we've torn that up. There is no more agreement. They made a deal with the devil, and a bunch of countries, perhaps, that enjoy writing things on paper rather than taking substantive action and have an interest in getting Iranian energy out of that country, didn't really have the world's best interests at heart. We're thinking in a bigger strategy than just European personal sentiments.
But right at the beginning, you mentioned, I mean, the two countries which you are really in tandem with on this are Saudi Arabia and Israel. And over that alliance, the Europeans in particular have got many questions about how close we should be to Saudi and indeed Israel.
Well, Europe is at a crossroads in its history. It needs to decide where its loyalties lie. Donald Trump is drawing definitive lines in the sand, not theoretical red lines like a previous president. Europe has the greatest friend in the world in America, and Europe has been a foundational block of Western civilization and the creation of Israel. And let's not forget that the situation in the Middle East was drawn up mainly by European powers. So the idea that the Americans have come in to try to fix a very terrible historical situation, and Europe somehow is finding itself caught in a moral quandary is a little bit just unhelpful. If Europe doesn't want to help us, fine, good luck to them, but it would be the wrong decision.
But they might also be looking at Saudi Arabia and being very nervous about Saudi Arabia and indeed its future, and thinking this is not an island of stability in the region.
Well, the House of Saud, compared to most of the regimes and leaders and despots that come and go in that area, has actually been quite stable. And Saudi Aramco and various organizations out of that country have been quite stable. Now, I'm not here to at all disagree with the moral problems, the obvious recent killing of journalists, these kind of behaviors, but in the end, the world is full of multicultural, different people with different belief systems, and you don't really get to pick your friends, but you do get to decide to pick people who don't want to kill you. And that's a big difference between certain regimes. So for all its faults, the House of Saud is an ally of the United States of America, an ally of Israel, and an ally of Europe, like it or not.
I think that's correct. The House of Saud is an ally of Israel and the United States. One of the things the financial press, both in the United States and in Europe, has pointed out is that these sanctions, not just the sanctions in Iran, but other sanctions as well against Russia and elsewhere, have worked, as you said, quite well, because they're not using hard power in the sense. In particular, America is exerting its control over international financial transactions, which really you can't do business around the world without avoiding America's grip on that mechanism. It's called SWIFT, but I don't want to go into technical details. We now seem to suggest, and many in the financial press are saying, if America pushes this too much, China and even the Europeans might start trying to escape from America's control over those financial transactions. How do you see that? Is that a real danger, you think?
Well, I think there's the age of the American dollar hegemony being in the 70% plus range, obviously, is going to be a natural reduction through the Chinese and European currency. I don't see it as a problem in the sense that they don't have much of a choice. I mean, it might sound brutal, but they don't. I mean, why would our allies not want to work with us after all we've worked with them? So if they want to make that choice, I think they'll make the threat. I really do. I think they'll be, insulted and they'll hum and haw, but ultimately they'll go along with it. China is much, much more concerned with the economic deal than opposed to the Iran deal. So if China comes with us on Iran, we work with them on economics. I mean, Trump is a deal maker. That's what he does. And he does a lot of sort of extreme things and then pulls back and, as we've seen, makes much more rational agreements. If you look at the sanctions put on the Revolutionary Guard, for example, there was exceptions made for NGOs and whatnot. So there's flexibility there. There's room to work. And I think that if people just come and have a dialogue with this administration, they'll find them very willing to work as long as there's a clearly defined goal where actual results can occur.
Well, interestingly, I mean, just moving slightly off the subject, at this very moment, Kim Jong-un from North Korea is in Vladivostok meeting with Vladimir Putin. Putin is going to be going on to Beijing for a new summit around this whole idea of the new Silk Road, of which Iran, together with Turkey, is quite an important element for China. I mean, how do you see what China is doing, allying itself with Russia, with Iran, with Turkey? Is this in effect attempt at just a negotiating ploy, or are the Chinese trying to build up a counter to United States hegemony?
Oh, well, I mean, on one hand, there is just a pure economic point, but there certainly is an attempt to create a multipolar world order. The Chinese Silk Road is not only an economic project, but a cultural project. The alliance between them, Turkey, and Russia is of little surprise. Whether or not that coalition and bloc can challenge the world order that America has built and plunged billions of dollars into creating a stable situation, looking at NATO, looking at the UN, all these IMF, World Banks. So it's not a surprise that rising powers, especially China, would be able to come into that field and create contest. And we're looking at a kind of a new low-key Cold War that's going on around the world as the Chinese come into a place where it's traditionally been Western dominated. And countries like Turkey and Russia are happy to do whatever they can see to find instability in the American sort of world order.
We have to leave that discussion there, but thank you very much to Erol Morkoc for joining us. Now, Sri Lankan was